The security guard's hand slammed against the glass door, with a sound that echoed through the marble lobby like a gunshot. "No babies allowed in the arena, ma'am. Club policy." His voice carried the cold authority of someone who had delivered this line 1,000 times before, but his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of recognition, then immediate regret. The young woman clutched her infant closer to her chest, the baby's soft whimpers barely audible above the distant roar of 15,000 voices chanting from inside Madison Square Garden. Her press credentials hung around her neck, legitimate and current, but they might as well have been made of paper in a rainstorm. Behind her, a line of reporters and photographers shuffled impatiently, their expensive equipment weighing heavy on their shoulders as they watched this unexpected drama unfold. "But I'm credentialed press," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've covered every major fight this year. This is my job." The guard's partner emerged from behind the security desk, his bulk filling the narrow space between the metal detectors. "Lady, you heard him. No exceptions. There's a daycare 2 blocks down if you need somewhere to—" "She stays with me." The words came out sharper than she intended, protective instinct overriding professional composure. "If you're already feeling the tension building, drop a comment with 'just so I know you're following along with this incredible story.'" The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across the polished floor, turning the lobby into a stark battleground of black and white. Through the thick glass doors, she could see the arena's entrance tunnel, the same path every legendary fighter had walked before stepping into immortality. Tonight was supposed to be her breakthrough, the assignment that would finally prove she belonged in a world that had spent decades telling women like her they didn't. The baby stirred against her shoulder, tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of her blazer. She had planned everything perfectly, the interview questions, the camera angles, even the backup formula in her bag. What she hadn't planned for was this: standing in a lobby that suddenly felt more hostile than any boxing ring, fighting a battle she never saw coming. "Look, I understand you have a job to do," she began again, but the first guard was already shaking his head. "So do I, and my job is keeping unauthorized personnel out of that arena. Your baby doesn't have credentials." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like smoke. Behind her, she could hear the other journalists murmuring, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed irritation. Time was bleeding away. In 20 minutes, the main event would begin, and she would either be inside documenting history or standing in this lobby, watching her career crumble through a glass door. The arena's sound system crackled to life, announcing the evening's first undercard fight. The crowd's response was immediate and thunderous, a wave of sound that seemed to make the very walls vibrate. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of every sacrifice that had brought her to this moment. The late nights, the missed family dinners, the constant battle to prove herself in a profession that still saw her as an intruder. When she opened them, something had changed in the lobby's atmosphere. The conversations had stopped. The shuffling had ceased. Even the security guards had turned their attention toward the arena's main entrance, where a small crowd was beginning to gather. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Not from any change in the air conditioning, but from the sudden shift in energy that occurs when greatness enters a space. The crowd outside had begun to part, creating a natural corridor, and through it walked a figure that needed no introduction. Muhammad Ali moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life turning violence into poetry, each step deliberate and measured despite the tremor that had begun to affect his hands. His presence filled the lobby in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size and everything to do with the weight of legend. The conversations that had resumed in hushed whispers died completely. He approached the security checkpoint with the casual confidence of someone who had never been denied entry anywhere. But his eyes, those same eyes that had stared down Sonny Liston and Joe Frazier, were focused not on the guards or the metal detectors, but on the young woman holding her baby near the glass doors. The first security guard straightened his posture, suddenly aware that his evening had just become exponentially more complicated. "Mr. Ali, sir, we'll get you processed right away. If you could just—" Ali raised one hand, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, but it carried enough authority to stop the guard mid-sentence. He walked past the checkpoint, past the other journalists who had begun fumbling for their cameras, and stopped directly in front of the woman and her child. "What seems to be the problem here?" His voice was softer than it had been in his fighting days, but it still carried the cadence that had once proclaimed him the greatest to anyone who would listen. The lobby had become a theater, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. But what exactly that something would be remained hanging in the air, as fragile and unpredictable as a butterfly's flight path. The baby chose that moment to look up at the towering figure before them, and for just an instant, the greatest heavyweight champion in history and a 6-month-old child regarded each other with mutual curiosity. It was a moment that seemed to exist outside of time, suspended between what had just happened and what was about to unfold. What Muhammad Ali did next would not only change the course of that evening, but would create a story that would echo through the halls of Madison Square Garden for decades to come. A story about power, principle, and the moment when a legend decided that some fights are worth having outside the ring. The security guard cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Sir, we were just explaining to this lady that arena policy doesn't allow—" Ali's eyes never left the woman's face as he spoke, but his words were clearly intended for everyone in that lobby. "Tell me something," he said, his voice carrying the rhythm that had made him as famous for his words as for his fists. "When did Madison Square Garden start turning away mothers?" And with that single question, everything changed. The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in the center of the ring. The security guards exchanged glances, suddenly aware that their routine enforcement of policy had transformed into something far more complicated. The woman felt her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear now, but from the surreal realization that Muhammad Ali, the Muhammad Ali, was standing 3 feet away, apparently taking her side in a battle she had been fighting alone moments before. "Sir, it's not about mothers," the first guard stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like steam. "It's arena policy, insurance liability. We can't have infants in the press section during a boxing match." Ali nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation with the same careful attention he had once given to studying his opponent's weaknesses. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small notepad, the kind reporters used, and began writing something with deliberate, measured strokes. The Parkinson's that would later claim his voice was already affecting his hands, making each letter a small act of determination. The baby had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. This tiny, peaceful child had somehow become the center of a confrontation involving one of the most famous athletes in the world. "You know," Ali said, still writing, "I've been coming to this arena for 15 years, fought here twice, won both times." He looked up from his notepad, his eyes moving from the guards to the growing crowd of onlookers. Never once saw a sign that said, "No babies allowed." The second guard shifted uncomfortably. "It's not posted, sir, but it's standard policy for safety reasons." "Safety." Ali repeated the word as if tasting it. "Let me tell you about safety." He folded the notepad and slipped it back into his pocket. "This young lady here," he gestured toward the woman, "she's got more courage standing in this lobby with her baby than most men have stepping into that ring. You want to talk about safety? She's keeping that child safer by having her close than by leaving her with strangers." The woman felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they weren't tears of frustration anymore. They were something else entirely: gratitude, validation, and the overwhelming sensation of being seen and defended by someone who understood what it meant to fight against systems that seemed designed to keep you out. "Mr. Ali," she began, but he held up that same gentle hand. "What's your name, sister?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. I write for Sports Weekly." Sarah Mitchell. He repeated her name as if committing it to memory. "And what's this beautiful baby's name?" "Emma. She's 6 months old." Ali smiled then, the same radiant expression that had charmed reporters and intimidated opponents for decades. "Emma. That's a strong name. She's going to grow up knowing her mama never backed down from a fight." The crowd around them had grown larger. Other journalists had begun taking pictures, their camera flashes creating a strobe effect in the marble lobby. Arena staff members were emerging from offices, drawn by the commotion. Even some early arriving spectators had gathered near the entrance, sensing that something significant was happening. You've got to be wondering what Ali's planning to do next. If you're as invested in this moment as I am, drop a respect in the comments below. The head of arena security appeared, a tall man in an expensive suit, whose expression suggested he was already calculating the potential public relations nightmare unfolding in his lobby. He approached the group with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. "Mr. Ali, I'm Frank Morrison, head of security. Is there some kind of problem here?" Ali turned to face Morrison with the same calm intensity he had once brought to press conferences before title fights. "Frank, good to meet you. Yes, there's a problem. You've got a policy that's keeping a working mother from doing her job. Now, I'm no lawyer, but that sounds like discrimination to me." Morrison's face flushed slightly. "Sir, with all due respect, our insurance policies are very clear about minors in the arena during events." If something were to happen, Ali interrupted, "you'd have the same liability whether that baby was in the press section or the general seating area. You sell tickets to families, don't you, Frank? I've seen plenty of children at fights in this arena." The logic was unassailable, and Morrison knew it. His policy enforcement had just been exposed as arbitrary and discriminatory by one of the most famous people on the planet, in front of a growing crowd of witnesses and cameras. Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of amazement and professional fascination. She was witnessing Ali in action, not the boxer but the activist, the man who had sacrificed years of his career for his principles. He was fighting for her the same way he had once fought against the Vietnam War, with unwavering conviction and tactical brilliance. "Look," Morrison said, his tone becoming more conciliatory, "maybe we can work something out. We could arrange for childcare, or perhaps nothing." Ali's voice carried a note of finality. "This woman has credentials. She has a job to do. Her baby is quiet, well-behaved, and poses no threat to anyone. The only problem here is a policy that was written by people who never had to choose between their career and their child." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued with the timing of a master storyteller. "I'll tell you what's going to happen, Frank. Either Sarah Mitchell and her daughter Emma walk through those doors with full access to cover tonight's fights, or Muhammad Ali walks out of this arena and tells every reporter in New York City exactly why." The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that it took a moment for its full implications to register. Morrison's face went through several color changes as he calculated the potential fallout. A story about Muhammad Ali walking out of Madison Square Garden in protest would dominate sports headlines for weeks. The arena would be portrayed as discriminatory, outdated, and hostile to working mothers. But Ali wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket again and withdrew what appeared to be a business card, which he handed to Morrison. "That's the number for my attorney. He specializes in civil rights cases, very good at his job, almost as good as I was at mine." The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, making a small sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet lobby. Emma opened her eyes and looked around at all the faces staring down at her, then made what could only be described as a happy, gurgling sound. Several people in the crowd chuckled, and the tension that had been building like pressure in a steam valve suddenly found a release. Ali laughed too, a rich, warm sound that seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the lobby. "See that? Even Emma knows this is ridiculous. She's ready to cover her first fight." Morrison looked around at the crowd, at the cameras, at the expectant faces all waiting to see how he would handle this moment. He was a man who had spent his career managing security for one of the world's most famous venues, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this particular scenario. "Mr. Ali," he said finally, "you make a compelling argument." "I usually do." Morrison turned to Sarah, and she could see the exact moment when he made his decision. "Ms. Mitchell, I apologize for the confusion. You and your daughter are welcome to access the press area. We'll make sure you have everything you need." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Camera flashes went off like fireworks. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief and gratitude. She had won, not just access to the arena, but something much more valuable. She had been defended by a legend, validated by a champion, and treated with the respect she had been fighting to earn her entire career. Ali placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you remember this night. Not because of what happened in that ring, but because of what happened right here. You stood your ground, you didn't back down. That's the most important lesson you can teach little Emma. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. You thank me by doing your job, by writing the truth, by showing the world that mothers can be journalists and journalists can be mothers, and there's nothing wrong with being both. As the crowd began to disperse and the normal flow of arena traffic resumed, Ali walked with Sarah toward the press entrance. The security guards, now looking somewhat sheepish, waved them through without any further questions. The metal detectors beeped their routine warnings, credentials were scanned, and suddenly Sarah found herself walking through the tunnel she had been staring at through glass just 30 minutes earlier. The arena opened up before them like a cathedral of sport. 15,000 seats rose in steep tiers toward a ceiling that seemed to disappear into darkness. The ring sat in the center like an altar, bathed in brilliant white light that made everything else fade into shadow. The smell of popcorn and beer mixed with the underlying scent of anticipation that permeated every great sporting venue. Beautiful, isn't it? Ali said, stopping to take in the view. I never get tired of seeing it. All those people coming together to witness something special, to be part of something bigger than themselves. Sarah adjusted Emma in her arms and looked around at the arena that had seemed so impossible to enter just moments before. It really is. You know what the secret is? Ali asked, his voice taking on the philosophical tone that had made him as famous for his wisdom as for his athletic ability. It's not about the fighting. It's about the courage to step into the ring in the first place. Tonight, you stepped into your ring, and you won. They walked together toward the press section, past vendors setting up their concession stands, past ushers preparing for the evening crowd, past all the invisible machinery that made a night like this possible. Emma slept peacefully through it all, unaware that she had just become part of a story that would be told and retold for generations. As they reached the press area, Ali stopped and turned to Sarah one final time. I've got to go take care of some business, but I want you to know something. What happened back there, that wasn't about me being famous or powerful. That was about what's right. And sometimes, when you're fighting for what's right, you find allies in unexpected places. He paused, looking down at Emma with a gentle smile. This little girl is going to grow up in a world where her mother showed her that you don't have to choose between your dreams and your family. That's a gift worth more than any championship belt. Sarah watched as Muhammad Ali walked away, moving through the arena with the easy confidence of a man who had never met a challenge he couldn't face. She found her assigned seat in the press section, set up her equipment, and prepared to cover the fights that would fill the next several hours. But as she sat there holding her sleeping daughter and looking out at the ring where legends were made, she knew that the most important story of the evening had already been written. It was a story about courage, about standing up for what's right, and about the moment when one of the greatest champions in history decided that some battles are worth fighting outside the ring. The first fight began 20 minutes later. Sarah covered every punch, every round, every decision, with the professional skill that had earned her those credentials in the first place. Emma slept through most of it, waking only occasionally to nurse or to look around with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child experiencing something entirely new. As the evening progressed, other journalists began to approach Sarah, asking about what had happened in the lobby. Word was spreading through the press section, then through the arena, and eventually to the wider world. By the time the main event concluded, the story of Muhammad Ali's stand for a working mother had already begun to take on a life of its own. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand, Sarah would tell her about that night. She would explain how sometimes the most important victories happen outside the spotlight, in lobbies and hallways, and moments when someone with power decides to use it for someone who has none. She would tell her about the night Muhammad Ali proved that being a champion wasn't just about what you could do in the ring, but about what you were willing to do for others when the cameras weren't rolling and the crowd wasn't cheering. And she would tell her that the greatest lesson of that evening wasn't about boxing or journalism, or even about standing up to discrimination. It was about the simple truth that when you fight for what's right, you never fight alone. The arena emptied slowly, 15,000 people filing out into the New York night, most of them unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the lobby before they arrived. But for those who had witnessed it, for those who had been part of it, the memory would last forever. As Sarah packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, she found a small piece of paper tucked under her notebook. It was the page Ali had torn from his notepad earlier, the one he had been writing on during the confrontation with security. In his distinctive handwriting, slightly shaky but still strong, he had written, "To Emma, may you always have your mother's courage and your own dreams. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and never let anyone tell you where you don't belong. Muhammad Ali." Sarah held the note against her chest and looked down at her sleeping daughter. In 20 years, when Emma was starting her own career, facing her own challenges, fighting her own battles against systems that tried to limit her potential, she would have this story. She would have this proof that champions come in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with fists, but with principle. As they walked out of Madison Square Garden that night, mother and daughter together, Sarah realized that she had witnessed something far more valuable than any sporting event. She had seen what happens when power meets principle, when fame meets fairness, and when a legend decides that his greatest fight might be the one he wages for someone else's right to be in the room. The story would be told and retold, growing with each telling, becoming part of the mythology that surrounds both Muhammad Ali and Madison Square Garden. But at its heart, it would always remain a simple truth. That night, when a young mother was told she didn't belong, the greatest heavyweight champion in history looked at an unjust policy and decided to throw the most important punch of his career. And like all of Ali's best punches, it landed exactly where it was supposed to. What strikes you most about this story? Ali's immediate response to injustice, or the way one moment of courage can change everything? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, pass it on to someone who needs to hear that champions come in all forms, and sometimes the greatest victories happen outside the ring. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the spirit and character of Muhammad Ali, created to honor his legacy of fighting for justice both inside and outside the boxing ring.